High school students across the state will soon have to score higher than before on the standardized MCAS tests in order to graduate, after officials approved a controversial new plan yesterday. The State Education Board voted 8-3 in favor of Elementary and Secondary Education Commissioner Adam Reilly's proposal, which will kick in starting with the class of 2026, despite overwhelming opposition to the plan from members of the public who submitted comment this spring. Students have had to score a certain level on both English and math in the MCAS, or Massachusetts Comprehensive Assessment System, in order to graduate since 2003. But under the new plan, the bar will be raised from 472 to 486 on the English exam, and then again to 500 for both English and math, beginning with the class of 2031. All of this comes at a difficult time for students, which people on both sides of the issue acknowledge. Amid the new stresses of the pandemic, MCAS scores last September dropped by huge margins across the state. And then there are longstanding equity concerns surrounding the MCAS and a wide variety of marginalized student groups, as well as a fierce and ongoing debate about whether standardized testing makes things worse or helps push low-performing schools to be better. I'm joined now by Education Board member Martin West, who proposed the adopted amendment to the Commissioner's plan that further raised the graduation requirement to a score of 500 in future years. He's also the academic dean at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and by Lisa Guisbond, the executive director at Citizens for Public Schools. Thank you both for being here. Martin, let me start with you. Why was this the right moment to make standards tougher rather than keep them as they were?
Well, this decision that we took yesterday is the product of a years-long process. So back in 2019, the state adopted what is known as the Next Generation MCAS for 10th graders. And this was a new assessment, an improved assessment. And when we adopted that, we engaged in a step of setting interim standards that would apply to the first two classes to take that new assessment, the classes of 21 and 22. And early in 2020, we began the process as a Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, as a Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, by forming an advisory committee to offer advice to the Commissioner and the Board on the subject of what the standards on the new test should be. And that process was interrupted by the pandemic, as was the administration of MCAS. So we've been in interim status for a number of years now. So we felt, as we turned to the class of 26, the group of freshmen that will be entering school this fall, that it was finally time to restart this process, to continue a process that had always intended to set an interim standard and have that become a permanent standard. And so earlier this year, we formed an advisory committee again, representing diverse stakeholders across the state. Educators were a big part of that. And their recommendation to us as a board was that, yes, we should move forward with raising the standard. I can talk a little bit about the evidence that went into that, but that was the clear recommendation from the advisory committee that we formed, and that informed the action that we took today.
Okay, let me jump to Lisa now. I want to get you in here. We've heard from Martin why he believes it was the right moment to raise standards, part of a process that's been in play for a while. Lisa, why do you think this is the wrong moment to be doing what we're doing?
Well, I think it's a terrible moment to do this because of all of the disruptions that our students and teachers and families have been through during the pandemic that have affected their lives in many ways. But I also think it's a step backward in general, regardless of the moment, because you may know that Massachusetts is an outlier in continuing to use a graduation test. We're one of only 11 states that still do that. And most other states in the nation have moved away. I believe it was a high of 27 states at one point, down to about 11. Because of all the concerns that many people raised, I believe, in the public comment. It's like 98% opposition in public comment to this move because of the impact on so many student groups, including students with disabilities, English learners, students from low-income households, Black and Brown students. So terrible moment, and a backward step instead of a positive step for our policy.
Tell me if I've got this right. Put simply, the concern that people have when it comes to those groups that you've mentioned is that they're now going to be less likely to graduate, and then members of those groups will have a black mark working against them as they enter adulthood. Is that a fair synopsis?
Yes, that, and also the impact on the education that they have when they're in school. There was public comment from Representative Jim Hawkins, who used to be a teacher, a 10th grade math teacher, and he described what happens when kids fail and the focus of their education becomes even more narrow, geared toward passing the test, and they lack access to a lot of the things that make school engaging and worthwhile and exciting in high school.
Got it. Martin, I want to go to the point of public feedback that Lisa mentioned. We mentioned it in the introduction to the segment. How did you and your fellow board members incorporate that overwhelmingly negative feedback about the prospect of enhanced or tougher graduation requirements, if you incorporated it at all? How did you think through what you heard from people?
Well, as I said, the commissioner's proposal to the board was deeply informed by a robust process of engaging the public in this decision-making process. And so it is true, Lisa's correct, we did not make any specific changes to the proposal that the commissioner had put out as a draft for public comment in response to the comments that we received for that process. But I think it's wrong to say that the public was not engaged in it. Of course, the people that you may hear from in a formal public comment process may not be representative of the state as a whole. And I think that's clearly what happened in this instance. The other thing I would say is that a lot of the public comment was urging us to abandon MCAS as a graduation requirement at all. And that's something, frankly, that's not within our mandate to do. The Education Reform Act of 1993 says we as a board are charged with articulating the level of expectation that students need to meet on a criterion reference test tied to the state's academic content standards. So that's our responsibility. We couldn't respond to most of the comments that we received without violating that statute. And then the last thing I would say is that while we did not make specific changes to the proposal that we adopted yesterday in response to the comments that we received will in many ways inform the department's implementation of this new requirement. So a lot of attention was paid by the commenters to the need to make sure that alternative pathways to a diploma for those students who first failed the test are available, that they're widely disseminated, that they are implemented in an effective way, and that you can expect will influence what the department does in that area going forward.
I want to actually back up even a little more and make sure that we're really clear here. It's information that I need myself to be educated as I think this through. I quoted some score increases or score increased thresholds at the beginning, you know, from 400 something to 400 something. But I don't know what that means, and I'm guessing a lot of people watching at home may not know what that means. How many more questions are we talking about kids having to get correct in order to pass the MCAS and go on and graduate? Neither one of you can hop in and tell me, but is it, you know, one more question on English out of a 50-question test? Is it something else? What are we talking about concretely?
I can't answer this one. I can't answer the specific number of questions.
Okay.
Here's what I can say. To confuse things even more, there are two different standards that the board was setting yesterday. One is the level of performance that students need to meet in order to be able to receive a diploma, along with completing what we call an education proficiency plan. And so that is the lower of the two standards.
Right.
There's a higher standard which says if you meet that, you don't need to go through this education proficiency plan process. And so we made changes to both of those. What you see on the slide here is the level of expectation for avoiding the education proficiency plan process. Well, what is an education proficiency plan? It is a notification of parents on an annual basis of the additional supports the student will receive in order to raise their competency in math and English language arts. And there's some other components that go along with it. But it's intended to provide additional supports to students who need to raise their achievement in order to meet the board's expectations. The more binding standard is the one below which students can't receive a diploma even with the education proficiency plan. And there, the change, the current score required is 455 in English language arts, and that is going up to 470, and from 469 to 470 in math. So only a single point increase.
Which doesn't sound like a lot to me. I'd love to know, again, concretely exactly what it means. Lisa, had you said that you wanted Martin to tackle that you also don't know if it's one more question correct or two more questions correct?
Well, I just think it's interesting that you asked that question and the answer's so complicated and it doesn't really get at explaining to me or other parents or students, like, how does this all really measure whether someone is ready to move on to pursue the goals they have in their lives? And I would argue that it doesn't. It's like a black box. It's this very mechanical, sort of business-minded way of looking at human beings that you can sort of set the goal, the sales goals higher and everyone work harder to achieve the goals. But that's not how education works, at least according to all the educators that I respect.
You mentioned, I actually want to ask you about something that you mentioned, Lisa. You said that you saw this as doubling down on a fundamentally flawed approach. You're opposed to the MCAS in principle. It's not just the increased standards. You don't want the test to exist. Fair?
I'm opposed definitely to using the MCAS to decide who gets a high school diploma.
Got it.
Most of the rest of the country has rejected.
Thank you for the clarification. It's an important one.
Yeah.
I heard the new president of the Mass Teachers Association on our radio airwaves today saying, well, we're going to be back when the Baker administration's gone and we're going to be pushing to move in the opposite direction. But tell me, maybe I'm missing something, but I'm not aware of any groundswell when it comes to eliminating the MCAS as a graduation requirement. I haven't heard Maura Healey talk about it. I don't think I've heard Jeff Deal talk about it in the governor's race. But maybe I'm wrong. Is there a push that you think could lead to the MCAS being jettisoned entirely down the road as a graduation requirement?
I think it's pretty increasingly unpopular, especially the graduation requirement. And half the legislature signed a letter to the Board of Education certainly opposing this policy of increasing the passing score. And the letter that they sent just really outlined a lot of the problems with high stakes testing in general. So I do think, the way the legislature works, everything has to go through these committees, with the committee chairs having a lot of power about whether anything ever gets out of committee. But it was very interesting to me that when you sort of put this letter out there that was signed by half the legislators, they represent voters. They have constituents. They're elected, not appointed.
And again, just to drive home, they were talking about the increase as opposed to the continued use of the test as a graduation requirement, period.
The specific focus was the increase. But as I said, I read the letter and many of the points in the letter apply more broadly to using the test to determine who graduates from high school.
Martin, I want to give you the last word here. I know you were trying to get in and then I made a point of asking Lisa a question, but you work at the Harvard Grad School of Education, which I think of as being something of a mecca when it comes to progressive approaches to education. From your vantage point there and from your vantage point as a board member, what are people missing when they talk about maybe getting rid of the test entirely as a graduation requirement? Why would that be a bad idea?
Well, I keep mentioning this advisory committee, which had the chance to look closely at the evidence that we've accumulated over time about how the students' performance on the MCAS test is related to their long-term outcomes. And when we look at post-secondary outcomes in the state, when we look at earnings of students in the labor market, we find this robust relationship, even when we compare students from similar demographic backgrounds, even from the same high school. And this really tells us that the MCAS is capturing skills that matter for student success. And so it seems to me that we're missing the fact that these tests do tell us something about what students need to succeed. They don't tell us by any means everything about what they need to succeed. And school districts have lots of room to offer a much broader definition of student success. But our role as the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education under the Education Reform Act is to articulate standards in this domain. And that's what we've sought to do. Just to give you one concrete way to think about the
very quickly, because we're
made,
almost out of time. Yeah, make it speedy.
Roughly 3,300 students we estimate would not pass the elevated standard relative to who would have passed had we left the standard unchanged. Now, what does that mean for them? Hopefully, they'll raise their expectations and meet the standard. That has been the state's history. Graduation rates have increased as we've had this requirement in place. But if not, they will have to pursue one of those alternative pathways. And so we don't see this as something that will increase dropout rates. We think it's something that will help students succeed.
Okay, we got to leave it there. Martin West, Lisa Guisbond, thank you both.
Thank you.